Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 143rd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And we know it's Mental Health Awareness Month, and this year's theme is loneliness. So today we're going to be talking about the fact that sometimes, whether people have mental ill health that's diagnosed or they're feeling low, why it can be so difficult for people to accept help. And don't forget, I really love hearing from you as listeners. And to make this super easy, I've created a place online where you can leave me a voice note anonymously or with your name you choose, called SpeakPipe. The link is in the show notes, but in case you want it now, it's bit.ly/SPKPDMP. So I wanted to talk about this topic of why people won't accept help, because it's something that comes up quite a lot in training, or that people have said, we've tried everything, whether we're the manager, whether we're working with HR, and nothing seems to work. And I think that it's complex, isn't it? And I think particularly in the family and friend zone, this can be hugely challenging. And I always talk about the fact that in the workplace, we have policies and procedures and ways of behaving. Now, we know that people don't always adhere to them, but at least there's a framework. And I always make a joke, semi-joke, and say that no family sits down and says, right, what's our communications policy? What's our health and safety policy in our home? So it is different. And I think this can be really challenging all round. I'm going to give examples from the workplace, but it can be more difficult in a family or friend zone, as I've mentioned. And I think sometimes the thing is that many of you will have been on training, you will be reading on the subject, you'll be trying to do your best, and you think, gosh, why won't these people or a person get help or do something differently? And often in the workplace, it can get to a crisis point. Dare I say it, get to a capability review, which, are really unpleasant experiences along with grievances, in order for people to take some action. Now, of course, we don't really want that to happen, but the reality is that it does happen. And I think the way that it affects, if you as someone who maybe feels reluctant to get help, is you can't necessarily articulate it. You can't explain to people why. You're really worried about fear of coming across as irrational, whatever that is, because everyone's reality is slightly different. And I think, again, if you're the line manager or support colleague that's trying to support, you can end up feeling super, super frustrated. And additionally, if you're someone who's responsible for people and culture in your organization, it can put you in a really difficult situation, and you may be left feeling quite helpless, or also quite frustrated, or potentially quite mercenary, in that you just have to go ahead and follow procedures without taking account of the individual and their lived experience. So I think this is something linked to emotional intelligence to an extent. So first of all, we have to reflect on where we are, and then we have to also manage ourselves. We have to think about others and also then manage that relationship. So this is based on the emotional intelligence quadrant popularized in Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. But first of all, if we're trying to support someone or we feel frustrated with them, we have to really be mindful, first of all, about what are we feeling? How did these feelings arise? Potentially, this has happened to us before with someone we care about, and it can reactivate those feelings. And also just to think about, what do these feelings carry in terms of the information? What are they trying to tell us? We might feel rotten, we might feel low, we might feel frustrated, we might feel angry. And I think it's listening to that. Then the second bit in terms of actions is self-management. So thinking about, how do I want to feel? And maybe it's about stepping away, because then you need to think about, what do you need to do in order to feel that way? And then in terms of that other person and having awareness, it's what might they be feeling, whether we connect to it or understand it, and what's our best educated guess around how these feelings have arisen. And then in terms of the relationship management, so if you're a supportive colleague or a manager, how do you want them to feel? And you might even start to think about that proverbial magic wand that I talk about quite a lot. What might you need to do in order for them to feel that way? And I'm going to share with you some techniques or some things that might be useful to you, because it's also important to remember that someone might experience mental ill health, but they also might be quite a difficult person. So there's the mental ill health or them experiencing not being in a great place and not feeling mentally optimum, but people can also be challenging and difficult, and those things can be completely separate, but I think when someone needs help or when someone needs some encouragement, the two can overlap somehow. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and want to keep up to date. Then why not join my bi-monthly newsletter where you'll receive information, tips, and ideas on mental health and inclusion. And you can join the mailing list at bit.ly/DMSYNR. Okay, so what can we really do then to solve this? Is it solvable? I think is one of the first things to ask ourselves. And I think it's important to remember not all of these things are solvable. There are ways in which, if we go back to what I outlined in terms of self-awareness and self-awareness for others, social awareness and relationship management, it can be incredibly tricky, particularly in the personal space. But I want to share with you something called the Cartman Drama Triangle, which many of you will be familiar with. It's had lots of iterations, and Cartman sort of brought it to the forefront in the late 60s, early 70s. You might also know it as the bullying triangle. You might also know it as transactional analysis for those of you who've got more of a therapeutic background. Now, I really want to simplify this, and I don't want to make it about therapy, but what I do want to do is kind of highlight what might be going on. So if you think of a triangle, an equilateral triangle, and if you put one of the apex of the triangle at the bottom, you've got what's called the victim at the bottom, at the apex of this triangle that's turned upside down, although, do triangles really turn upside down? But the apex is facing the bottom. And the victim may be going through a very, very challenging time. And it's not that they're not a victim. The victim is labeled in terms of mentality. So they say, poor me, I feel powerless, hopeless, and stuck. And then if we move up to the right-hand side of the triangle, we have what's called the persecutor. Now, in a traditional bullying context, the persecutor would be a bully. So someone who's exhibiting bullying behaviors. And don't forget to check out, I've got lots of episodes, but in particular, the episode with Dr. Chloe Goff, who talks about bullying cultures in the workplace. And the bully will be, exhibiting things. It could be shouting, although that's quite rare in the UK workplace. It could be withholding information, behaviors that we might associate with bullying. But in this context, in terms of why people might not access help, the persecutor could be a policy, a procedure, a criteria, the way that the system works. And so it feels very punishing. It feels like the system is punishing someone. Of course, it could be a line manager or a colleague or someone outside the workplace. And then if we move over to the third part of the triangle, the rescuer, we've got someone who wants to rescue someone, who says, let me help you, let me do it all for you. And that's someone who is an enabler, even though you're trying to try really hard, a pain reliever, and it keeps that victim mentality there. And then this is all on the outside of the triangle. And in the middle of the triangle, we have to visualize the word adult. And the word adult is important because the adult mode in this context is about someone who is being supportive, but being boundaried, realizing that they can't do everything for everyone. They try really mindfully to not get sucked into the rescuer mode and be an emotional crutch, but equally say things like, this sounds really tough. This sounds really difficult. There are some things we can do. These are the choices. Which one do you want to go with? Now, I also know that that's much easier for me to highlight when I haven't got someone in front of me. I'm not currently line managing anyone. There aren't all of these feelings whirling around for me. But it is all very easy to slip into the rescuer mode. And that's not about punishing yourself. That's about being mindful and saying, okay, I don't really like being in this space. I'm over helping. And actually, I need to think about what I might need to do differently. So if we think about it, the person who is in that victim mode feels overwhelmed by their sense of vulnerability, inadequacy, or powerlessness. They do not take responsibility for themselves. They do not feel like they have any choice in the matter, and they feel very done on to. They will essentially seek a rescuer to look after them. And this dynamic can often turn sour, and the victim may turn on the rescuer and effectively become a persecutor when their boundaries drawn and the rescuer says, you know what, I've kind of had enough of this, maybe not in those words. And they get angry because I think taking control or empowering themselves is a real challenge. And then the rescuer will seek to rescue or help those who are vulnerable and tends to overhelp and take a lot of responsibility for that person. And as time goes on, they may feel very resentful and hard done by in due course. And then, as I mentioned, the persecutor, whether it's a policy, procedure, or criterion, or a person, it's about power used negatively and often very destructively. It might be malicious, it might be the type of organization, and it's all about defending themselves or as an individual. But if you think about organizations and some policies are not fit for purpose, it's about creating this kind of really strong fence so that the organization, the business cannot be attacked or cannot be to be felt under perceived attack or experience a kind of lack of productivity or not be the quote unquote best company there is out there. And some of the body language that you might see. So I think particularly for someone who might be in that victim role, it might be extremes. It might be things like, oh, I wish, I don't know, I don't care, not again, things never go right for me, worst day of my life, using superlatives. It could be deep sadness. It could be, irritability, anger, almost like temper tantrums, whining, rolling eyes, shrugging shoulders, all those things. If we think about toddlers who get very upset and angry, because some of that behavior might come out. Again, if we think about the rescuer, it's going to be, very open body language, trying to help, trying to overprotect potentially. But of course, this again, as I will mention, is a Eurocentric model. So it won't always sit right for all cultures. And in some cultures, a rescuer can be the kind of default mode. I think particularly women in South Asian cultures, if I can speak of my own background, we often feel we have to be in that role. And when we're not in that role, we're not good people. So of course, there's a lot to unpack in this. And this is not about judging anyone, but it's thinking about why don't people get help? And of course, it's not our responsibility, but what might we want to do to look after ourselves? And there might be a big blowout or a bad behavior from putting down those boundaries, but how important that is. And then I mentioned the adult mode, so in the middle of the triangle, and what might we see there? So we are seeing things like in the physical body, attentive, interested, straightforward, connecting with someone, not feeling threatened and not being threatening. Asking those open questions. So don't forget episode 97, listening to support, where I talk about open questions and what you might like to do. So the why, what, how, who, where and when, how much, what makes you feel that way, what's the truth of the situation. So if we think about these interactions, what needs to shift is that sort of victim mentality needs to take responsibility for themselves and recognize that they do have choices. I'm not saying for a minute that they are easy choices, but they do have, if we're thinking about UK workplaces in the main, some kind of power to make decisions. Now, I appreciate that that won't necessarily be the case for everyone across the board. So if I think about newly arrived asylum seekers, migrants, people who may be in very abusive relationships and may not have money to leave, they may not have a support network. Those things are going to add to these challenges. So I want to be specific, and I'm talking about those workplace scenarios, because I think the other scenarios I've mentioned, I don't have time to go into that today and talk about the intricacies of it. And actually, it might be an idea, if you've enjoyed this episode, to get an expert in to delve into that more. But usually people in a UK workplace will have some kind of choice they want to make in terms of their mental health and well-being and what they want to do. In the main, I know that won't be everyone. I know it also depends on systemic advantage and the way in which people have that autonomy. So I'm not completely naive when I talk about this, but exploring that topic of why won't people get help. And then in terms of the rescuer, they also need to take responsibility and think, you know what, I too have needs, I'm vulnerable, and to take a step back and not be so involved, even that it's going to feel incredibly, incredibly scary. And if someone is behaving as a persecutor, it's to acknowledge the behavior and the impact it has on others and develop skills to provide constructive feedback and let go of criticism. And then the adult is about extricating themselves from the drama, not necessarily the support, by being assertive and direct and enabling the other roles to find their way and using those open coaching skills. And I think underlying all of this is the kind of defense, anxiety, and hidden feelings or impulses. So this is known as the triangle of conflict by D. Malan, 1979. And essentially, when people get into conflict, whether that's with another person or a lot of this can be inside themselves. I should be okay. I should be able to pull myself together. I don't want help. That means admitting something. Or I've tried it before and it hasn't worked. It actually made me feel worse. Is that we'll all have been through this, whether we've experienced mental ill health or not, but feelings that pull us in different directions. So, it could be what's expected of us. Well, you might be aware of we have to be a certain way. What's been expected from us growing up, or what do we expect from ourselves? Who expects things from us now? And how are we trying to meet those expectations of ourselves? How we might defend ourselves then. Do we want to be open about this, or do we want to be closed? And also, what do we desire for ourselves? Do we like helping people? And does it make us feel really good? And so by doing that, we feel validated. That can also be something that comes up. And underneath our everyday actions and preconceptions, there are a set of deeply held beliefs about ourselves, values, also our goals. What are we hoping to get out of our life, and also what might be the patterns that prevent us. And then think about those anxieties and fears that are triggered when you move away from those expectations. It can feel scary, so you go back into that particular way that you're used to acting in. What's going to happen? Is there a lot of discomfort? And actually feeling that discomfort is very scary. So the question is, what's stopping you changing, or what's stopping you go into that adult mode? Some things to reflect on. So we've got the feeling, whatever that feeling is, and then there's also the anxiety about it. If we think about that self-awareness and self-management, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be feeling like this, or I shouldn't be feeling bad, they really, really need my help. And then the defense mechanism, oh, I'll just go and help, or no, I'm just really angry, I don't want to take responsibility. So that can be really useful to reflect on. And then finally, I just wanted to share with you the emotion, reality, and responsibility model, which is something I learned in my coaching training with Jackie Arnold. And this is a really great model to have this, a conversation. So essentially, it is when emotions are high, you want to check the reality and move the person to responsibility. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is super easy. I'm not saying that it doesn't take some practice. Just like with physical health, when we want to train or do something in the gym, we generally don't go from being a beginner runner to being an elite athlete. So it takes a while and it takes time. And this is exactly the same. Particularly with things like assertiveness, having these conversations, listening, not giving advice, it does take some time because it's a different way of behaving or doing things than we're used to. So if we check, first of all, we've got emotion. So that's the E of the ERR model. And this is, again, unusual, particularly in UK workplaces, but it's to acknowledge the emotions. So if we think about that social awareness, we want to acknowledge that person's emotion and ask that person how they are and give them the space to download and speak about their emotions. And we can say something like, I can see that you're angry, upset, frustrated. How are you feeling? And letting that person speak. And then if you move down to reality, it's things like, okay, I realize this has affected you. You seem very upset. Do you want to keep talking? Do you want to reconvene another time? I can see this is really difficult. What would you like to have happen now? Because that puts someone in the driving seat. I realize this is super tough and we've had this conversation before. What's different today, or what's changed for you today? If someone is unable to continue, particularly in the workplace, and you have the necessary means, you can refer them to your occupational in-house health team, if you've got it in-house, or a phone line, your employee assistance program, counselling, if you've got that in-house as well. Maybe they want to go home and they've got a next of kin list. They might require immediate support. And that also keeps us in the adult mode I mentioned, because unless you are, we're not stepping into unbounded territory. We're not saying, okay, I'm going to sit and talk to you for 4 hours, because most of us aren't trained counselors or therapists. And that's absolutely fine. We're there to let someone download and say, right, what would you like to happen? I can see that you're really upset. These are the choices that we have. If they're happy to continue and maybe they're just feeling frustrated and they want to have a bit of a rant, you can get them to summarize certain things, asking those open questions. So, what are the facts of the situation? What's triggered this? What are you certain about? What do you know about the situation? Reflecting their words back to them so they can hear what they've been thinking. You can even say, what will enable you to move forward? What would help you? What choices do you feel you have? What's your next step? what will support your well-being during this process? So that's a good one, because you're not saying, okay, I'll do this, this, and this, and this, and this, and I'll take everything away from you. Also, when would you like to meet again to discuss? If you're the kind of person that gets quite irritated with people and you think, oh, it's all in the policy, just get on with it. But actually asking this question, and they might even say, well, I don't really want to see you again. I think I need to go and refer myself to X service. And then, of course, summarizing what's been agreed. If there is something you're going to do, like get them a phone number, then that's absolutely fine. But it's not about taking everything away from someone. So that's important to remember. So what stops people from accessing support? It can be fear, it can be anxiety, it can be fearment of being judged. It's not easy, we know that. Workplaces are tricky, and personal places are even trickier. And thinking about, well, what can I do to empower someone or help them to think of themselves as an empowered individual? It's very easy to rush into jumping in and rescuing someone and overhelping. And whilst we want to be supportive, we have to be supportive with boundaries, because ultimately, unfortunately, it doesn't help someone to get help. And there are techniques and things that we can do to encourage people to recognize their emotions, to see the reality or what's going on for them through their eyes, and encourage them to take responsibility to improve how they're feeling. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. I also love it when people leave reviews. So if this is your first show or you're a regular listener, why not leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts? And I've got a link to the resources in the show notes. And if you do want to leave me a message and tell me what you want to listen to, what you want to hear in future episodes, don't forget my speak pipe at bit.ly/SPKPDMP. Until the next episode, we'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.